The winter skies over Europe in the early 1940s were filled with thunder. The roar of engines, the piercing whistle of diving aircraft, and the relentless staccato of machine gun fire were not just sounds of battle. They were the echoes of a continent at war. The Luftwaffe, once considered the most formidable air force on Earth, had darkened the skies of Europe. From the invasion of Poland to the fall of France, the German war machine seemed unstoppable. Their fighters, sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s and fearsome Focke-Wulf 190s, ruled the air. Their bombers brought cities to ruins. To many, the Luftwaffe appeared invincible. And yet, somewhere across the Atlantic, a new chapter of aerial warfare was quietly being written. A chapter the Germans never saw coming. The story of the P-51 Mustang begins not with American glory, but with a British request. In 1940, as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, the Royal Air Force was desperate for fighters. The Spitfires and Hurricanes were valiant, but Britain needed more and fast. The North American Aviation Company, approached with an urgent proposal, was asked if they could produce Curtiss P-40s under license. But instead of copying an old design, North American engineers proposed something bold, something new. In just 117 days, they sketched, built, and flew the prototype of what would become the Mustang. At first, it was just another fighter among many, not yet the legendary machine it would later become. Its early version, with Allison engines, were fast at low altitudes but struggled in the thin, cold air above 15,000 feet. For the high-altitude dogfights over Europe, it seemed unsuitable. At least, that's what the experts thought. Meanwhile, the air war over Germany was intensifying. By 1942, the United States had joined the fight, sending fleets of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators to strike at the heart of the Reich. Daylight bombing was a bold strategy meant to cripple German industry with precision attacks. But there was a deadly flaw. Without adequate escort, the bombers were flying into a storm of German fighters. Mission after mission, entire formations were shredded. Crews knew the odds. A deep penetration into Germany meant facing waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, each one eager to set a flying fortress ablaze. Losses were staggering. The daylight bombing campaign seemed on the verge of collapse. Something had to change. Back in Britain, an idea sparked that would alter the course of the air war. Engineers realized that if the Mustang could be fitted with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance, it might transform into a completely different aircraft. The experiment was carried out, and the results were astonishing. The new P-51 Mustang with the Merlin engine soared at high altitude, climbing faster, flying farther, and fighting harder than anyone expected. It wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. Suddenly, the Allies had a fighter that could escort bombers deep into Germany, all the way to Berlin and back again. A machine that could finally stand toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe's best and even outmatch them. But the Germans didn't know this yet. For years, they had fought with confidence, believing their fighters would always dominate. They had been warned of new Allied planes before, only to see them fail or prove unremarkable. The Mustang? To them, it was just another war machine, one more aircraft among many. What they didn't realize was that this sleek, long-nosed fighter was about to become their nightmare. Picture the scene, January 1944. The bombers are forming up over England, their destination, deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots are waiting, scanning the skies for easy prey. They know the Americans are coming. But today, something is different. Instead of breaking away and leaving the bombers exposed once fuel ran low, new fighters stay in formation. They climb higher, push farther, and refuse to turn back. Their silhouettes are unfamiliar. Their engines roar with a new, menacing tone. These are the P-51 Mustangs. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe realizes the rules of the game have changed. The arrival of the Mustang was more than just the introduction of a new airplane. It was the beginning of the Luftwaffe's unraveling. German pilots who had once hunted bombers with impunity now found themselves hunted in return. The skies that had once belonged to them were no longer safe. And this shift, gradual but unstoppable, would turn the tide of the air war over Europe. It would give the Allies the air superiority they needed to launch D-Day, to cripple German industry, and to bring the Reich to its knees. But to truly understand the Mustang's impact, we need to look deeper into the psychology of the pilots, the strategies of the commanders, and the bitter duels fought miles above the earth. The Mustang was not just a machine. It was a symbol of persistence, ingenuity, and timing. And the Germans, who had once laughed at the idea of American daylight raids, now faced a terrifying new reality. They were being outflown, outgunned, and outlasted. The Mustang story is not just about metal and engines. It is about men. Young men strapped into cockpits, breathing oxygen through frosted masks, their hearts pounding as tracer fire streaked past their canopies. It is about bomber crews who once prayed for survival, now looking out their windows to see silver Mustangs slicing through enemy fighters, keeping them alive. It is about German pilots who, after years of dominance, felt the cold shock of defeat as their comrades fell one by one. The invincibility of the Luftwaffe shattered before their eyes. The war in the air was a chess match, with moves and countermoves, victories and losses. But the introduction of the P-51 Mustang was like bringing a queen onto the board when your opponent thought you had only pawns left. Its speed, range, and firepower didn't just balance the scales. It tilted them entirely. For the Luftwaffe, it was the beginning of the end. This is a story of how an aircraft born from desperation, doubted in its early days, transformed into the scourge of the Luftwaffe. A story of innovation, courage, and a twist of fate that the Germans never expected. And as we peel back the layers of history, we'll see how the Mustang crushed the myth of German air superiority and helped seal the fate of the Third Reich. The first missions with the Mustang were almost surreal. Bomber crews, who had once flown with the grim certainty that half their formation might not return, suddenly found themselves guarded by an invisible shield of speed and firepower. At first, they couldn't believe it. The Mustangs didn't peel away after a few hundred miles, like thunderbolts or lightnings. They stayed with the bombers, mile after mile, deeper and deeper into German territory. The crews looked out from their cramped, frozen gun positions and saw them, long-nosed fighters darting like wolves among the German packs, cutting through enemy formations with breathtaking precision. For the men trapped inside those lumbering flying fortresses, the sight of a Mustang silhouette against the sun was a glimpse of hope. For the Luftwaffe, however, it was a shock. They had built their reputation on aggressive, coordinated attacks. They would swarm the bombers in waves, striking from head-on, from below, from behind, relying on overwhelming numbers and tactics that had been refined since the Battle of Britain. Their goal was simple: tear holes in the formation, set engines on fire, break morale. And for a time it worked. But now, every time they formed up for an attack run, they had to look over their shoulders. The hunters had become the hunted. The Mustang's Merlin engine gave it the power to climb rapidly and strike from above. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns unleashed a storm of fire that shredded German aircraft in seconds. Pilots spoke of duels where the Mustang's agility outmatched the heavier Focke-Wulf 190s, and where its range allowed it to chase Messerschmitts long after other Allied fighters would have turned back. The Germans had relied on the idea that American escorts would always run out of fuel before the bombers reached critical targets. But the Mustang erased that advantage overnight. One of the most devastating consequences of the Mustang's arrival was its ability to strike not just at German fighters in the sky, but their very lifeblood, their bases, their infrastructure, their replacements. By early 1944, Mustang pilots were conducting fighter sweeps over German airfields, catching aircraft as they tried to take off or land, strafing runways, destroying fuel depots, even wiping out squadrons before they could reach the fight. Every destroyed Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf wasn't just one less plane in the sky. It was months of lost training, an irreplaceable pilot, and a crack in the Luftwaffe's armor. For the young German pilots of 1944, the war had already become a nightmare. Unlike the veterans who had cut their teeth in Spain, Poland, and France, these men were often rushed into combat with minimal training. They were told that the Reich depended on them, that their duty was to defend the fatherland. But when they climbed into their cockpits and faced swarms of bombers guarded by Mustangs, reality was cruel. Many never survived their first sortie. The Luftwaffe, once proud and dominant, was bleeding to death in the skies. The Mustang's effectiveness wasn't just in its numbers. It was in the psychology it carried. German pilots began to dread the very sight of its silhouette. Veterans who had once believed in their own superiority suddenly admitted that the Mustang was a machine they could not ignore. In letters, diaries, and after-action reports, the word spread. The Americans had a new fighter, and it was winning the war in the air. But the Mustang was more than a weapon of destruction. It was also a symbol of Allied cooperation and ingenuity. Remember, its transformation came from blending American design with British engineering. Without the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the Mustang might have remained just another average fighter. It was this fusion of ideas across oceans and nations that produced the aircraft that would change everything. In many ways, the Mustang embodied the Allied war effort itself. Different nations, different strengths, working together toward a single decisive goal. Among the most famous Mustang units was the 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen. These African-American pilots, fighting not only the Luftwaffe but also prejudice and doubt within their own ranks, proved their worth in combat. Flying crimson-tailed Mustangs, they built a reputation for discipline and skill, escorting bombers with such reliability that crews began to request the Red Tails by name. Their story became a legend, a reminder that the fight against tyranny was being waged on multiple fronts, against enemies abroad and barriers at home. The Mustang also gave birth to unforgettable personalities. Pilots like George Preddy, the highest-scoring P-51 ace, whose deadly accuracy brought down dozens of enemy aircraft, or Don Gentile, whose bold tactics earned him the nickname the Ace of Aces. These men became symbols of the Mustang's lethality, their exploits broadcast in newspapers and radio, fueling the morale of a public hungry for good news. But perhaps the most astonishing fact about the Mustang was how swiftly it turned the tide. In the first months of 1944, before the P-51 was widely deployed, bomber losses were devastating. Raids on places like Schweinfurt and Regensburg had cost hundreds of planes, thousands of lives. By mid-1944, with Mustangs flying escort, the survival rate soared. Missions that had once seemed suicidal became achievable. The Luftwaffe, which had once bled the bombers white, was itself being bled dry. German commanders were forced to face a truth they had long denied. They could not win the war in the air. Even the introduction of advanced aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter came too late, and in too few numbers to change the outcome. By the time these technological marvels arrived, the Mustang had already secured dominance. The Luftwaffe's training schools were empty, its fuel supplies dwindling, its veteran aces gone. The skies over Germany belonged to the Mustang, and this dominance carried consequences far beyond the clouds. With the air secured, the Allies could launch the D-Day invasion in June 1944, confident that the Luftwaffe would not rise in strength to repel it. The Mustang had done more than protect bombers. It cleared the path for liberation. The Germans never expected it. They had underestimated the Americans, underestimated the ability of industry to adapt, and underestimated the resilience of men flying long hours over enemy territory. The Luftwaffe had believed its reign unshakable, but the Mustangs shattered that illusion with speed, range, and firepower. As the months passed, German pilots were forced into desperate tactics. Some resorted to suicidal ramming attacks. Others tried to ambush bombers in the last moments before reaching their targets. But nothing could stem the tide. The Mustang was everywhere, above, behind, lurking in the clouds, diving from the sun. The once proud Luftwaffe was collapsing under the weight of attrition, its dream of dominance dissolving into smoke trails across the sky. By the end of 1944, even the most die-hard German commanders admitted the truth. The Mustang had broken them. And yet, the story was not finished. The final chapters would play out in the spring of 1945, as the Allies advanced into the heart of Germany, the Mustangs leading the way, crushing the last remnants of resistance. But to grasp the full impact of that climax, we must follow the Mustang to its ultimate role in the destruction of the Luftwaffe, to the day when even the most feared German aces found themselves powerless, and the skies above the Reich burned with the fire of defeat. By 1945, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. They were ruled by the Mustangs. What had once been a battlefield of equals had become a one-sided hunt. where the Hunter was now unmistakably American. The once proud German Air Force that soared so high in the early years of the war was now staggering, battered, and gasping for survival. The transformation was stark. In 1939, the Luftwaffe had seemed untouchable. Its victories were swift, decisive, almost terrifying in their efficiency. Cities burned, armies crumbled, and German fighters roared over conquered lands. But 6 years later, their dominance was gone, and their skies were swarming with the long-nosed predators they had once dismissed. The P-51 Mustang was more than just a machine. It was a symbol that the tide had turned, and that Germany's defeat was inevitable. Every day, the Mustangs flew deeper into the Reich, escorting vast formations of bombers that poured destruction onto railways, factories, oil refineries, and supply lines. German industry was collapsing under the weight of this relentless assault. Without fuel, without spare parts, without train replacements, the Luftwaffe was choking. The war machine that had once thundered across Europe was grinding to a halt. The impact on German morale was catastrophic. Young pilots, barely out of training, climbed into cockpits knowing the odds were stacked against them. They had watched their instructors vanish into smoke and fire, their role models cut down by American fighters. Even the aces, the men who had once seemed untouchable, were being hunted down. The Mustangs gave no quarter. They roamed the skies in packs, diving into enemy formations, scattering them, chasing stragglers to the ground. German veterans who had once boasted of victory after victory now spoke of survival, of finding a way home alive. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They deployed the Me-262 jet fighter, a technological marvel far ahead of its time. In the hands of skilled pilots, it was lethal, capable of outrunning any propeller-driven aircraft in the world. But the jets arrived too late, and in too few numbers. Fuel shortages, Allied bombing of production plants, and Hitler's insistence on using them as bombers instead of interceptors crippled their potential. For every Me-262 that took the skies, dozens of Mustangs were waiting. They ambushed the jets during takeoff and landing, striking when the machines were most vulnerable. The Mustang's dominance was so overwhelming that even the future of aviation, the jet age, could not arrive fast enough to save the Luftwaffe. On the ground, the devastation was just as severe. Mustang pilots strafed trains, convoys, and supply depots. They hunted fuel trucks and locomotives, leaving plumes of smoke rising from the countryside. For German civilians, the war was no longer something fought at the edges of the Reich. It was above their heads, every day, relentless and merciless. The howl of a Merlin engine meant destruction was coming. And yet, through this destruction, a grim reality emerged. The Luftwaffe was not just losing airplanes. It was losing men, irreplaceable men. At the start of the war, Germany had possessed the most experienced pilots in the world, hardened in Spain and sharpened in Poland and France. But war is a predator that devours the best first. By 1944, many of these veterans were gone, replaced by boys barely trained in the basics of flight. Against them stood Mustang pilots who were flying mission after mission, gaining experience, growing sharper, deadlier with each battle. The balance had tilted irreversibly. One by one, the names of Germany's greatest aces were scratched from the skies. Werner Mulders, Adolf Galland, Erich Hartmann, and countless others, legends of the Luftwaffe, face a new reality. For every victory they claimed, the Mustangs claimed 10. For every bomber they tried to strike, a Mustang was waiting behind them, guns blazing. The psychological blow was immense. What good was experience when the enemy had overwhelming numbers, endless fuel, and the deadliest fighter of the war? For the Allies, the Mustang became a rallying symbol. Crews painted them with nose art, gave them names, turned them into icons. They were no longer just fighters. They were guardians, protectors, avengers. Bomber crews began to believe they could survive because of the Mustangs above them. Soldiers on the ground cheered as the sleek silver fighters streaked overhead, a reminder that the skies now belonged to them. And for the Germans, there was no hope of recovery. The Luftwaffe had once been a storm. Now, it was scattered clouds, torn apart by relentless winds. In the final months of the war, when the Reich itself was collapsing and Soviet tanks rolled in from the east, the Luftwaffe could offer no shield. The skies were silent, except for the constant drone of Allied bombers and the sharp growl of Mustang escorts. The climax came not in a single battle, but in the slow, crushing inevitability of defeat. Each mission flown by Mustangs chipped away at Germany's strength, eroded its will, broke its capacity to resist. By the time the Americans crossed the Rhine and marched into the heart of Germany, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The air battles that had once decided the fate of nations were now lopsided slaughters, with inexperienced German pilots falling from the sky in flames before they even saw their attackers. And so the war in the air ended not with a final duel, but with silence. The Luftwaffe, the terror of Europe, the weapon that had carried Hitler's armies across the continent, was gone, crushed not only by sheer numbers, not only by Allied industry, but by a single machine that had arrived at the perfect moment, the P-51 Mustang. It is said that wars are won not only by armies, but by ideas. The Mustang was one of those ideas, a fusion of need, ingenuity, and timing. Born from desperation, doubted at first, transformed by a British engine, it became the weapon that ensured Allied victory in the skies. Its range allowed bombers to strike deep into the heart of Germany. Its speed and firepower crushed the Luftwaffe's best fighters. Its presence gave hope to crews who once prayed only for survival. And above all, it proved that even the mightiest enemy could be defeated. The Germans never expected it. They had built their empire on the belief that their technology, their pilots, and their will could not be challenged. But history is full of surprises. The P-51 Mustang was one of them. And when it came, sleek and silver against the blue sky, it brought with it the end of the Luftwaffe and the beginning of Allied victory. Today, when we look at the Mustang, we don't just see a machine of war. We see a symbol of endurance, of courage, of the turning tide of history. Its roar still echoes at air shows, its lines still inspire awe, but its legacy is written not in the smoke of battle, but in the freedom it helped secure. The Luftwaffe had once ruled the skies, but the Mustang reminded the world that no empire lasts forever. And as its pilots returned home, some as heroes, some as memories, one truth remained. The P-51 Mustang had crushed the Luftwaffe, and with it, the illusion of German invincibility.